The lights in the lecture hall flickered once, then steadied, and every cadet in the room went quiet the moment Professor Vantor Krell slammed his clawed hand on the podium. "Deathworld," he said, and the word hung in the air like a threat. "Today we discuss the single most dangerous classification of planet known to the Coalition. Pay attention. Some of you will face one someday, and I would rather you survive it." I sat in the back row, third seat from the window, notebook open, stylus ready. My name is Mira Sloan, and I was the only human in that room of 43 cadets from 11 different worlds. I had gotten used to the stares by then. What I had not gotten used to was how fast this particular lecture was about to turn my entire life into a horror story for everyone else. Vantor Krell was a Thren, tall and silver-scaled, with eyes that never seemed to blink. He paced in front of the massive display screen behind him, and with a flick of his wrist, the first slide appeared. Bold red letters, Class 5 Deathworld traits. Gravity exceeding 1.2 standard units. He read aloud. Such worlds crush the bones of most known species within a decade of exposure. A few cadets shifted uncomfortably. I did not move. I just wrote the number down, because back home, that was called Tuesday. Multiple apex predators, occupying overlapping territory with the dominant species, he continued. This alone disqualifies 90% of habitable worlds from safe colonization. Someone near the front, a Korvath cadet with feathered ridges along his neck, made a small sound of discomfort. I kept writing. Toxic or semi-toxic flora integrated into the primary food chain, Vantor Krell said next, tapping the screen. Entire ecosystems where a single wrong choice at dinner can end a life. I thought about the mushroom foraging trip my grandfather took me on when I was 9 years old, and how he made me memorize which ones would kill me before he let me touch a single one. I did not raise my hand yet. I was still deciding if this was worth interrupting a class for. Unstable weather systems, capable of leveling settlements without warning, the professor went on, his voice picking up a rhythm now, like he was building towards something. Worlds with a large orbital moon causing extreme tidal disruption. Worlds where the dominant species itself engages in organized internal conflict on a near-constant basis, despite having the intelligence to avoid it. That last one landed differently in the room. A ripple went through the cadets. Even the Thren students, who I was told came from a fairly rough homeworld themselves, looked a little pale around the gills. "Such a world," Vantor Krell said, spreading his arms wide like he was presenting a punchline, "would be, statistically speaking, uninhabitable for complex intelligent life. And yet, in the rare event that a species does emerge from such conditions, the Coalition flags it immediately as a matter of extreme interest and extreme caution." He let that sit in the air for a moment, clearly pleased with himself, like he had just described something purely theoretical, a monster from a bedtime story meant to keep young cadets in line. That was when I raised my hand. I did not raise it fast. I did not raise it dramatically. I lifted it slowly, the way you do when you already know the answer to a question nobody wants asked out loud. Vantor Krell blinked, which for a Thren was apparently a rare event, because half the room turned to look at him in surprise before they even looked at me. "Cadet Sloan," he said, his voice carrying a note of mild irritation at being interrupted mid-rhythm, "you have a question." "Not really a question," I said. My voice came out calmer than I expected. More of a comment. "Go on then." I looked around the room first. 42 pairs of eyes, some with slit pupils, some with no pupils at all, some blinking sideways, all waiting. "Stop," I said. "You're describing my childhood." For a moment, nobody said anything. Then a small laugh broke out near the middle of the room, the kind of laugh people give when they think a joke has been made. A Viserion cadet with pale blue skin actually smiled, waiting for the punchline that would explain the joke to her. There was no punchline. I let the silence stretch a little longer before I continued. I grew up in a place called Florida, on Earth, and everything you just listed on that screen, I did not read about it in a survival manual. I lived it, all of it, at the same time, starting before I could walk. The laughter died fast. Vantor Krell's tail, which had been swaying gently behind him, went completely still. "Explain," he said, and his voice had lost its rhythm entirely now. It was flat, careful, the voice of someone who suddenly suspected he had said something far more serious than he intended. "Gravity first, since that's an easy one," I said. "Earth sits right around one standard gravity, so I won't pretend that one's extreme, but I want you to remember that number, because it matters later, when you hear what else we dealt with at that same gravity." A few cadets exchanged glances. I kept going before anyone could interrupt. Apex predators sharing territory with the dominant species. On my continent alone, we had alligators living in the same waterways where children learned to swim. We had large cats in the forests near our neighborhoods. We had sharks along every coastline, and people still went into the ocean for fun, on purpose, every single day. The Korvath cadet in the front row made a small strangled noise. "Toxic flora integrated into the food chain," I said. "We had berries that looked exactly like the safe ones, but would stop your heart if you ate the wrong handful. We had snakes whose bite could kill a grown adult in under an hour if you didn't get help fast enough. My grandfather taught me which mushrooms to avoid before he taught me most other things, because that lesson came first. It had to." Vantor Krell had not moved from his spot at the podium. His hand, still resting near the podium controls, had gone very still. "Unstable weather, capable of leveling settlements," I continued. "We called those hurricanes. Every single year, on schedule, storms strong enough to tear roofs off houses and flood entire towns would form out over the ocean and come straight for us. We didn't relocate the population. We built stronger houses, stocked supplies, and waited them out, every year, same season, like clockwork." "And the moon," I said, glancing toward the ceiling like I could see it through the roof. "Our moon isn't especially large compared to some others in the Coalition catalog, I'll admit that one honestly. But it was enough to move entire oceans twice a day, every day, and coastal communities simply built their entire lives around that rhythm without a second thought." Now, nobody in the room was laughing. Nobody was smiling either. Professor Vantor Krell had gone very quiet, and his tail had curled slightly against the leg of the podium, an old Thren habit I had read about once that apparently signaled discomfort. "The last one," I said, and I paused there, because even I felt the weight of it a little. "The internal conflict. That one I'm not going to pretend away. Humans have hurt each other throughout our entire history, sometimes in terrible ways, even while surrounded by everything else trying to kill us too. I won't sit here and tell you that part isn't true. It is. But I will tell you this. Despite every single trait you just listed on that screen, all of them, all at once, stacked on top of each other, generation after generation, we didn't just survive. We built cities. We wrote music. We raised children who grew up to do the same thing all over again." The room was silent except for the faint electric hum of the display screen still glowing behind the professor. Vantor Krell cleared his throat, a strange rasping sound I hadn't heard him make before. "Cadet Sloan," he said slowly, "are you telling this class that your homeworld meets every single criterion on this list?" "Simultaneously." "Yes, sir. And that your species not only survived under those conditions, but developed the intelligence and technology required to reach orbital travel and eventually join this coalition?" "Yes, sir." He looked down at the podium, then back up at the class, then back at me, as if he were double-checking that he had heard correctly and none of us were playing some elaborate joke on him. "I see," he said, though it was clear he did not fully see yet at all. He tapped the screen, and the bold red words Class 5 Deathworld traits stayed exactly where they were, except now every single cadet in that room was staring at those words with a completely different expression than they had 5 minutes earlier. The Viserion cadet who had smiled earlier now looked slightly ill. The Korvath cadet had gone very still, his feathered ridges flattened against his neck. Even the 2 Thren cadets near the front, from what I was told was one of the rougher worlds in known space, were staring at me like I had just grown a second head. Vantor Krell set down his stylus. He did that slowly, deliberately, the way someone sets down a tool when they realize the job in front of them just became much bigger than expected. "Class dismissed early today," he said, his voice quieter than it had been all lecture. "Cadet Sloan, please remain behind." Chairs scraped against the floor as cadets gathered their things, whispering to each other in half a dozen languages, throwing glances back at me the entire time they filed toward the door. I caught fragments of words I didn't fully understand yet, but the tone was unmistakable, something between disbelief and quiet alarm. I stayed in my seat, notebook still open, stylus still in my hand, and watched the room empty out around me, while Professor Vantor Krell stood at his podium, staring at the word Deathworld on the screen like he was seeing it for the very first time. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. Outside the tall windows of the lecture hall, 3 moons hung in a purple evening sky, calm and distant, nothing at all like the one I grew up under. And for the first time since arriving at the academy, I realized that everyone around me had spent their whole lives assuming a death world was something that only existed in theory. I knew better. I had grown up in one. Professor Vantor Krell did not speak again until the last footsteps faded from the corridor outside. When he finally looked at me, his expression had changed completely from the confident lecturer who had walked into that room an hour earlier. He looked like someone who had just been handed a puzzle with a missing centerpiece, and I was the only one who could show him what it looked like. "Cadet Sloan," he said, "I need you to understand something. That list I presented today was never meant to describe a living, breathing civilization. It was a theoretical worst-case scenario, built from data models and simulations. No coalition survey has ever recorded a species that matched more than 2 of those traits at once, let alone all 6. "I understand that now," I said. "I didn't realize it was theoretical to everyone else until I watched your face change." He studied me for a long moment, then gestured toward the door. "Walk with me." We left the lecture hall together and made our way down a wide corridor lined with tall windows. Cadets from a dozen species passed us in both directions, most too busy with their own schedules to notice us, though a few slowed their pace when they recognized me from the earlier class, whispering to their companions as we passed. "I would like to bring this to the attention of the Xenobiology Department," Vantor Krell said. "Formally, with your permission, I believe what you shared today may be more significant than either of us initially realized." "You want to interview me," I said. "I want the department to interview you," he corrected. "Properly, with recorded documentation. If even a fraction of what you described today holds up under scrutiny, it changes several assumptions we have held about Deathworld habitability for a very long time." I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about where this would lead, and by the following afternoon, I found myself seated in a much smaller room, this one lined with recording equipment and 3 researchers I had never met before. Vantor Krell sat off to one side, arms folded, watching quietly. The lead researcher introduced herself as Dr. Elowen Bracewell, a tall Viserion woman with pale blue skin and calm, steady eyes that never seemed to blink out of turn. Beside her sat a Korvath researcher named Denix Thal and a younger assistant, a human exchange student named Colin Ashford, who had been studying interspecies communication at the Academy for nearly 2 years already. "Cadet Sloan," Dr. Bracewell began, "thank you for agreeing to this session. I want to start simply. Walk us through a single ordinary day from your childhood. Nothing dramatic, just an average day." I thought about it for a moment, genuinely trying to pick something unremarkable. "When I was around 7 years old," I said, "my family lived near a canal close to our house. On a normal summer morning, my mother would tell me not to walk too close to the water's edge on my way to the bus stop because alligators sometimes came up onto the bank to sun themselves, and they could move faster than people expected if startled." Denix Thal, the Korvath researcher, leaned forward slightly. "An apex predator was a routine morning hazard on your walk to an educational facility." "Yes." "And your response to this danger was?" "To walk on the other side of the street," I said. "That's really it." We didn't think about it as danger exactly. It was just something you learned early, like looking both ways before crossing a road. Colin Ashford, the human assistant, gave me a small knowing smile, the kind two people share when they both understand something the others in the room don't yet. Dr. Bracewell made a note, then continued. Let's discuss the toxic flora you mentioned yesterday. Give us specifics. There's a plant called poison ivy, I said. It grows almost everywhere, along fences, in backyards, near hiking trails. If your skin touches it, you develop a painful, itching rash that can last for weeks. Children are taught to recognize its shape by the time they're old enough to walk through a garden unsupervised. A plant that causes harm simply through casual contact, Denix Thal said, writing quickly now. Not through consumption, through touch alone. Right, and that's one of the mild ones. There are others that are far more dangerous if ingested. Certain berries, certain mushrooms, even some flowering plants people kept in their own homes for decoration, which could cause serious harm to small children or animals if chewed. Decorative plants, Dr. Bracewell repeated slowly, capable of causing harm, kept willingly inside private dwellings. We liked how they looked, I said with a small shrug. We just taught the kids not to eat them. A long pause followed that comment. I watched Denix Thal set down his stylus entirely and simply stare at me for several seconds. Let's move to weather, Dr. Bracewell said, recovering first. You mentioned hurricanes yesterday. Describe the process your communities followed when one approached. About a week before a big storm arrived, we'd start watching weather reports closely. A few days out, people would board up their windows with wooden panels, buy extra food and water, make sure they had batteries and flashlights ready. On the day the storm actually hit, we would stay inside, away from windows, and just wait, sometimes for many hours. The wind outside could get loud enough that you couldn't hear yourself think, strong enough to snap trees in half and tear roofing material clean off houses. And afterward, Denix Thal asked, his voice quieter now. Afterward, we'd go outside, check on our neighbors, clean up the debris, and rebuild whatever got damaged. Sometimes, the same house got damaged more than once, across different years. People rebuilt it anyway. Every year, Dr. Bracewell said, not quite a question. Every year, it had a season. We literally named it hurricane season. It was on the calendar, right alongside holidays. Colin Ashford spoke up for the first time since the session began. I think what might help here, he said gently to the two alien researchers, is understanding that humans didn't experience these things as isolated catastrophes. They were woven into the rhythm of ordinary life. School schedules were built around them. Building codes were designed around them. It wasn't chaos to us. It was Tuesday. I glanced at him and almost laughed, because that was nearly the exact phrase I had used the day before without realizing anyone else might reach for the same words. Dr. Bracewell sat back slightly in her chair, her pale blue features unreadable for a moment. Cadet Sloan, I want to ask you something more personal, if you're comfortable answering. Go ahead. Given everything you've described, the predators, the toxins, the storms, did you experience these things as frightening, as children experience danger? I thought about that question carefully before answering, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a quick one. Some of it, yes, I said. I won't pretend a hurricane siren doesn't make your stomach drop the first few times you hear it, especially as a small child. But fear fades when something becomes familiar enough. You learn the rules, you learn the warning signs, you learn what to do, and eventually the fear turns into simple caution. Respect, maybe, rather than terror. You stop being scared of the ocean. You just learn which parts of it to avoid, and when. Denix Thal shook his head slowly, a gesture I had come to understand meant deep disbelief among his people. On my homeworld, he said, a single confirmed predator sighting within settlement boundaries triggers a full district lockdown lasting several days. Specialized response teams are required before normal activity resumes. On mine, I said, we just told the kids to walk on the other side of the street. Nobody said anything for a moment after that. Dr. Bracewell finally set down her own stylus and looked at me with an expression that mixed genuine scientific fascination with something else, something closer to quiet unease. Cadet Sloan, I have reviewed hundreds of species profiles across my career. I have never encountered a documented case of a technologically advanced civilization developing under simultaneous exposure to this many hazard categories. Frankly, the mathematical models we use to predict habitability would classify your homeworld as statistically implausible for intelligent life to emerge at all. And yet, here I am, I said. Yes, she said quietly, here you are. The session continued for nearly 2 more hours, moving through topics I hadn't expected to discuss so plainly, from extreme temperature variation between regions of the same planet, to the sheer variety of biting insects capable of transmitting disease, to something Colin Ashford mentioned almost offhandedly that made both alien researchers go still all over again, the fact that humans had, at various points in their history, deliberately kept large predator species as household companions. You brought a predator into your home, Denix Thal said slowly, as though testing the words for some hidden trick. Voluntarily. We call them dogs, I said. Some of them started as wolves, actually, a long time ago. People decided they made good companions, so over generations we changed them, and they changed us right back. Now some of them sleep in children's bedrooms. Denix Thal simply stared at me. He did not write anything down for a long moment. By the time the session ended, the recording equipment had captured nearly 2 hours of material, and Dr. Bracewell requested 3 separate follow-up sessions before the end of the term. As we packed up to leave, Vantor Krell, who had remained mostly silent throughout the entire interview, finally spoke. Cadet Sloan, he said, I owe you an apology of sorts. For what? Yesterday I presented that list as an academic exercise, a warning to frighten first-year cadets into taking survival training seriously. I never expected an actual answer from the classroom. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I am beginning to understand that I underestimated exactly how serious that warning should have been taken all along. I didn't quite know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded and gathered my things. As I walked back toward the cadet dormitories that evening, I noticed something I hadn't paid much attention to before. Small groups of cadets from other classes, ones I had never even met, glancing my way as I passed, then leaning toward each other to whisper. Word, it seemed, had already begun to travel. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was simple curiosity, the kind that follows anyone who says something unexpected in a room full of strangers. I had no idea, walking back to my quarters that night under 3 unfamiliar moons, that the real test of everything I had described was going to arrive far sooner than I expected, and that it would not come in the form of a recorded interview or a classroom lecture. It would come in the middle of a training exercise that was supposed to be perfectly safe. The alarm came without warning, 3 short pulses of red light sweeping across the transport bay walls, and every cadet around me went rigid at once. We were 4 days into a scheduled field exercise on a controlled biome preserve, a place the Academy used specifically to expose cadets to simulated Deathworld conditions in a safe, monitored environment. The preserve sat inside a massive containment dome on the edge of the Academy grounds, filled with imported vegetation, artificial weather cycles, and a small population of non-lethal creatures meant to test our observation and survival skills under supervision. It was supposed to be perfectly safe. That was the entire point of it. Our group that day included 6 cadets and 1 instructor, a broad-shouldered Thren named Instructor Sarn Vek, who walked ahead of us with the easy confidence of someone who had led this exact tour 100 times before. Beside me walked Denix Thal, the Korvath researcher's younger sibling and a cadet in his own right, along with a Viserion cadet named Talia Reyes, a quiet, careful young woman who rarely spoke unless she had something worth saying. We had been walking a marked trail through simulated wetlands for nearly 20 minutes when the ground beneath us shuddered, just slightly, like something heavy had shifted somewhere deep below the dome's foundation. "Containment fluctuation," Instructor Vec said calmly, tapping the communicator on his wrist. "Nothing to worry about. These domes run internal weather cycles that occasionally cause minor structural settling." Then the lights failed completely. For 3 full seconds, we stood in total darkness, the kind so complete it felt like the world itself had simply stopped existing. When the emergency lighting flickered back on, dim and red, the wrist communicator on Instructor Vec's arm was silent, and the trail markers that had been guiding us all morning had gone dark as well. "Everyone stay together," Vec said, his voice noticeably less calm now. "This is not part of the exercise." A low mechanical groan echoed somewhere above us, followed by a sharp hiss of escaping air. I looked up in time to see one of the dome's massive climate regulation vents crack open along its seam, releasing a thin cloud of pressurized mist into the enclosure. "The containment field has partially failed," Talia Reyes said, her voice tight. "That mist is releasing an active weather simulation directly into our section. We need to reach the emergency exit corridor." "Which is where, exactly?" Denixthal asked, and for the first time since I had met him, his usual composed tone had cracked slightly at the edges. Instructor Vec pulled up a small holographic map from his communicator, but the display flickered erratically, half the corridors marked in warning symbols that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "The nearest exit corridor is roughly 400 meters northeast," he said, "through the dense growth section." The dense growth section. I had read the exercise briefing the night before. That particular area of the preserve had been specifically designed to simulate low-visibility terrain, complete with imported thornbrush, uneven footing, and 2 of the preserve's non-lethal test creatures, large reptilian herbivores that startled easily and could grow aggressive if cornered. Behind me, I heard the wet hiss of the failing vent grow louder, and the temperature around us began climbing rapidly. Whatever weather cycle had just triggered, it was accelerating fast. "We move now," Instructor Vec said, already turning toward the northeast trail. "Stay in a tight formation, watch your footing." We moved. The dense growth section lived up to its name almost immediately, thick vegetation closing in around the narrow path, visibility dropping to only a few meters in every direction as the artificial mist thickened around us. The ground grew uneven beneath our boots, roots and loose stone hidden under a layer of fallen leaves. I felt something shift in me the moment we entered that low-visibility terrain, something old and familiar, like slipping into a well-worn pair of shoes. I had walked through terrain like this before, more times than I could count, back home, through forest trails during storm season when visibility dropped just like this, when the ground turned unpredictable and every step needed to be placed with care rather than speed. Ahead of us, Talia Reyes stumbled over an exposed root, catching herself against a low branch, her breathing quick and shallow. "Talia, look at your feet, not the path ahead," I said without thinking, moving up beside her. "Step where the leaves are flattest, not where they look softest. Softest ground usually means loose footing underneath." She glanced at me, startled, then adjusted her steps immediately, her balance steadying within a few strides. The mist thickened further, and somewhere off to our left, a low rumbling sound rolled through the brush, heavy and deliberate. Instructor Vec froze mid-step, his hand raising in a silent signal for the rest of us to stop. "One of the preserve's herbivores," he whispered. Startled by the containment failure, they rarely approach cadets directly, but under stress conditions, unpredictable behavior increases significantly. I listened carefully to the rumbling sound, the rhythm of it, the way it paused and shifted direction. It reminded me of something, a half-memory surfacing from a hiking trip years earlier, tracking the movement of a large animal through thick brush by sound alone, staying low, staying quiet, letting it choose its own path away from us, rather than forcing a confrontation. "It's moving parallel to us, not toward us," I said quietly. "If we keep our pace steady and avoid sudden movement, it should continue past without engaging." Instructor Vec glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read in the dim red emergency lighting, somewhere between surprise and cautious trust. "Cadet Sloan is likely correct," he said finally. "Maintain steady pace, no sudden movement." We continued forward, the rumbling sound eventually fading behind us, just as I had predicted, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to think the worst of it had passed. That was when the ground gave way beneath Denix Thal. He dropped with a sharp cry, vanishing waist-deep into a hidden depression hidden beneath the leaf litter, some kind of drainage channel the preserve's designers had built into the terrain and never properly marked. Talia Reyes rushed forward instinctively, reaching for his arm, but her footing slipped on the same unstable ground and she went down hard beside him, her ankle twisting awkwardly beneath her. "Do not move it," I said immediately, dropping to my knees beside her before she could try to stand. "If it's sprained, putting weight on it now will make it significantly worse." Instructor Vec had already moved to help Denix Thal, hauling him up out of the depression with some difficulty, the young Korvath cadet's legs scraped and shaking, but otherwise unharmed. I turned my attention fully to Talia, checking her ankle with careful hands, the same way I had checked countless minor injuries growing up, from siblings, from neighborhood friends, from the ordinary bumps and scrapes of a childhood spent mostly outdoors in unpredictable terrain. "It's swelling already, but I don't think anything's broken," I said. "We need to stabilize it and keep weight off it completely." "We don't have proper medical supplies out here," Instructor Vec said, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. "The exit corridor is still nearly 200 meters ahead." I looked around quickly, my eyes settling on a cluster of long, flexible branches from the imported vegetation nearby, along with the emergency strap fastened to my own field pack. "Give me a minute," I said, already moving. I worked quickly, snapping two of the sturdier branches to length, wrapping them carefully against either side of Talia's ankle, using the strap from my pack, along with a second one Instructor Vec produced from his own gear. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't proper medical equipment, but it was steady and it would hold her ankle in place well enough to keep her from making the injury worse while we moved. "This will hurt when you put weight through it," I warned her honestly, "but it should hold you steady enough to walk with support. I'll take your left side." Talia nodded, her jaw tight, and together we got her upright, her arm braced across my shoulders, my arm firm around her waist for balance. Denix Thal moved to her other side despite his own scraped leg, and between the two of us, we kept her moving forward at a slow but steady pace. The mist around us had grown thick enough now that I could barely see Instructor Vec walking just a few steps ahead, his silhouette blurred and red-tinted in the emergency lighting. The temperature continued climbing steadily, sweat beading along my forehead despite the artificial mist clinging cool and damp against my skin. "How much further?" Denix Thal asked, his voice strained under the effort of supporting Talia's weight alongside me. "Not far now," Instructor Vec called back, though his own voice carried less certainty than I would have liked. We pressed forward through the thickening mist, the ground beneath us growing more treacherous with every step, until finally, through the haze ahead, a dim green light appeared, steady and unmoving, unlike the flickering red emergency lighting that had surrounded us for the better part of 20 minutes. "Exit corridor marker," Talia said, her voice cracking with relief. We reached the corridor entrance moments later, a reinforced doorway built into the dome's outer wall, sealed against the artificial weather cycle raging behind us. Instructor Vec keyed in an override sequence, and the heavy door slid open with a hiss of pressurized air, revealing a clean, brightly lit maintenance corridor beyond. We half-carried, half-guided Talia through the doorway, and the moment the door sealed shut behind us, the mechanical groaning and hissing mist vanished entirely, replaced by the quiet hum of standard climate control. For a long moment, none of us said anything at all. We simply stood there, breathing hard, adjusting to the sudden calm after nearly half an hour of mounting tension. Instructor Vec was the first to speak, his communicator finally reconnecting to the Academy's main network with a soft chime. "This is Vec, reporting a containment failure in the preserve's dense growth section. All cadets accounted for. One minor injury, ankle sprain, currently stabilized. Requesting medical transport to the Northeast Maintenance Corridor immediately. As the confirmation came through, he turned to look at the three of us, his gaze settling on me longest of all. "Cadet Sloan," he said slowly, "where did you learn to read animal movement through dense brush by sound alone? Where did you learn field splinting technique without proper equipment? Where did you learn to identify unstable ground before stepping on it?" I thought about how to answer that honestly, and in the end, the simplest answer was the truest one. "Camping trips," I said, "storm evacuations, a childhood spent mostly outdoors, in terrain that didn't forgive mistakes very often. Nobody taught me these things in a classroom. I just grew up needing to know them." Denix Thal, still catching his breath beside Talia, looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before, something that had shifted from simple curiosity into genuine respect. "You did not panic," he said quietly. "Not once. Even when the ground failed beneath me, even when we heard that creature moving through the brush nearby, you moved as though you had lived through this exact situation many times before." "Because I have," I said, "just not with 3 moons overhead, and not inside a dome." Talia Reyes, leaning against the corridor wall with her splinted ankle raised carefully off the ground, managed a tired smile despite everything. "Is every human like this?" she asked, only half joking. "Or did we just happen to get assigned the unusual one?" I thought about my parents, my grandfather, my neighbors back home, the countless ordinary people who had faced storms and dangerous terrain and difficult mornings without ever once considering themselves remarkable for it. "Honestly," I said, "I'm probably one of the more ordinary ones." Nobody in that corridor seemed to find much comfort in that answer, and within the hour, as medical staff arrived to properly treat Talia's ankle and Academy officials began reviewing the containment failure that had triggered the entire incident, I noticed something new in the way people looked at me. It wasn't fear exactly, and it wasn't quite the fascinated curiosity from Dr. Bracewell's interview session either. It was something closer to careful, quiet reassessment, the kind of look people give when they realize the ground beneath their assumptions has shifted, and they haven't yet decided what to build on top of it instead. I didn't know it yet, standing in that clean, brightly lit maintenance corridor with adrenaline still humming through my veins. But that incident was about to travel through the academy far faster and far wider than any classroom lecture ever could, and it was going to reach the attention of people well above Professor Vantor Krell and Dr. Bracewell's department entirely. 3 days after the containment incident, I was summoned to a wing of the academy I had never even visited before, a quiet administrative building tucked behind the main campus, reserved for the Coalition Historical and Threat Assessment Council. I had assumed, walking through its tall glass doors, that I was simply being asked to give another statement about the preserve incident. I was wrong. The room I was led into was circular, ringed with data terminals and a massive central display currently showing a slowly rotating image of Earth, blue and green and achingly familiar, pulled from some old Coalition survey satellite that had apparently been quietly observing my homeworld for longer than I had known was possible. Seated around the room were representatives from several different departments, some of whom I recognized, including Dr. Elowen Bracewell, who gave me a small reassuring nod as I entered, and Professor Vantor Krell, seated near the back with his arms folded, watching quietly the way he had during our first interview session together. At the head of the room sat a council representative I had never met, an older Thren woman with pale silver scales and eyes that carried the weight of someone who had reviewed thousands of species assessments over a very long career. Her name, I would soon learn, was Counselor Ythera Voss, no relation to me despite the shared syllables in our names, a coincidence that seemed to amuse absolutely nobody in the room except me. "Cadet Sloan," Counselor Voss said, gesturing toward an empty seat near the center display, "thank you for joining us. Following the incident in the preserve, along with the recorded interview sessions conducted by Dr. Bracewell's department, this council authorized a full historical review of your homeworld's recorded data. We would like you present while we discuss our findings. I sat down slowly, feeling the weight of a dozen unfamiliar eyes settle on me at once. To be clear, Counselor Voss continued, this is not a formal inquiry. You are not required to answer questions you find uncomfortable. However, given the scale of what our researchers have uncovered over these past 3 days, we believed it appropriate for you to hear these findings directly, rather than through second-hand reports. She gestured toward the central display, and the slowly rotating image of Earth shifted, replaced by a timeline stretching across thousands of years, dense with markers and data points I couldn't fully read from where I sat. Let us begin with climate history, said a researcher I didn't recognize, a Korvath man with graying feathers along his neck. Our long-range survey data confirms multiple planetary ice ages throughout your species' evolutionary history, periods during which vast portions of habitable land became uninhabitable for extended stretches of time. We call those ice ages too, I said. Same name, actually. Your species not only survived these events, the researcher continued, but continued developing tools, language, and eventually complex civilization throughout each one. We didn't really have another option, I said. Staying still wasn't going to keep anyone warm. A quiet murmur passed through the room at that, though I couldn't quite tell if it was amusement or discomfort. The timeline shifted again, this time highlighting a cluster of markers spread across what looked like several centuries. Disease events, the Korvath researcher said. Widespread pandemics capable of reducing regional populations significantly within short time frames. Our models indicate at least 4 such events, severe enough that, on most surveyed worlds, they would have ended the dominant species' technological development entirely. We got through those too, I said quietly, thinking of stories my grandfather used to tell about his own grandfather, and the illnesses that had swept through their small town generations before. It wasn't easy. A lot of people didn't make it through some of those. But the ones who did kept building, kept teaching their children, kept moving forward. Dr. Bracewell spoke up gently from her seat near the display. Cadet Sloan, I want to highlight something specific here, if you don't mind. Our records show that following several of these disease events, your species developed increasingly sophisticated medical countermeasures, vaccines, sanitation systems, eventually entire scientific disciplines dedicated solely to understanding and preventing disease before it could spread. We got tired of losing people, I said simply, so we studied why it kept happening until we figured out how to stop as much of it as we could. Counselor Voss leaned forward slightly at the head of the table. There is one section of this review I would like to address directly, Cadet Sloan, and I want to be careful in how I phrase this. Our historians have also documented extensive periods of internal conflict throughout your species' recorded history. Wars, in your language. Organized violence between different groups of your own kind, occurring alongside everything else we have just discussed. The room grew quieter at that, and I felt the familiar weight of that particular truth settle over me the same way it had during Professor Vantor Krell's original lecture. That's true, I said honestly. I'm not going to sit here and pretend it isn't. Humans have hurt each other throughout our history, sometimes for reasons that, looking back, don't hold up to much scrutiny at all. It's one of the harder parts of our story to explain, and honestly, one of the parts we still work on today. And yet, Counselor Voss said slowly, despite this, and despite everything else documented in this review, your species not only endured, but actively worked to reduce this internal conflict over time. Our data shows a measurable decline in large-scale organized violence across recent centuries, alongside significant growth in cooperative international structures. We're not perfect, I said, not even close, but I think most people, most places, eventually get tired of losing things they care about and start looking for better ways to live alongside each other instead. A long pause settled over the room after that, and I noticed several of the researchers exchanging quiet glances. The kind of look that suggested this particular finding had complicated their assessment far more than any predator or storm ever could have. The Korvath researcher cleared his throat and continued, moving the timeline forward toward more recent history. There is one additional finding our team believes deserves specific attention, he said, glancing briefly toward Counselor Voss for permission before continuing. Records indicate that following major disaster events, whether environmental, medical, or otherwise, individuals from unaffected regions of your homeworld frequently traveled toward the affected areas voluntarily, offering aid without any formal obligation to do so. We call that disaster relief, I said. It's not universal, not everyone does it, but enough people do that it's become a fairly normal thing. When something bad happens somewhere, other people show up to help, however they can. Dr. Bracewell's expression shifted into something I hadn't quite seen from her before, a kind of quiet, thoughtful wonder. On my homeworld, she said, resource allocation following localized disasters typically prioritizes strategic value and proximity above voluntary participation. The concept of individuals choosing personal risk to assist unrelated strangers, purely from personal motivation, is not entirely unfamiliar to us, but it is far from common practice. It's not always common with us either, I admitted, but it happens often enough that most people expect it, on some level. When things go wrong, help usually comes from somewhere. A younger researcher near the back of the room, one I hadn't noticed speak yet, raised a tentative hand. Cadet Sloan, if I may ask something slightly less formal. Counselor Voss nodded her permission. Our records indicate, the researcher said, glancing down at a datapad in his hands, that your species domesticated several predator species throughout your history, including, according to Dr. Bracewell's earlier interview notes, descendants of what would have originally been a significant apex predator on your homeworld. Wolves, I said. Yes, a long time ago, some of our ancestors started forming relationships with wild wolf populations, and over many generations, both species changed because of it. Now we call them dogs, and a lot of people consider them family. You transformed a predator into a companion animal, the researcher said slowly, as though testing the concept for some hidden flaw. More or less. And they live inside your homes. Many of them, yes. Some sleep in the same rooms as children. The younger researcher simply stared down at his datapad for several seconds, saying nothing further. Counselor Voss finally leaned back in her seat, folding her hands together thoughtfully as she studied the rotating image of Earth still displayed at the center of the room. Cadet Sloan, she said, I have sat on this council for a considerable span of years. I have reviewed threat assessments for species considered among the most dangerous and resilient in known space. I want to be direct with you, in a way that I hope you understand is not intended as an insult. Go ahead, I said. When this review began, our working assumption was that your homeworld's classification would need to be revised upward, into a threat category typically reserved for species whose survival instincts translate primarily into aggression toward others. Predatory species, in the fullest sense of that term. I felt my stomach tighten slightly at that, though I kept my expression steady. However, Counselor Voss continued, what this review has actually revealed is considerably more complicated, and, I will admit, considerably more difficult to categorize using our existing frameworks. Your species did not simply survive an unusually hostile environment through aggression alone. You survived through adaptation, cooperation, memory, and an apparent willingness to keep trying, generation after generation, even when the odds, by every metric our models can produce, suggested you shouldn't have. The room fell quiet again, and I realized, somewhat uncomfortably, that every eye in that circular chamber was now fixed directly on me. We are not reclassifying your homeworld as a threat, Counselor Voss said finally. We are reclassifying it as something closer to an outlier, a case study. Frankly, Cadet Sloan, we do not currently possess an adequate category for what your species represents, and this council intends to spend considerable time developing one. I sat there for a long moment, unsure exactly how to respond to that, until finally I settled on the same answer I had given Professor Vantor Krell days earlier, the one that felt truest every time this conversation came up. "We just called it Tuesday," I said quietly. A few quiet, surprised laughs broke out around the table, the tension in the room easing slightly for the first time since I had walked in. Counselor Voss allowed the faintest suggestion of a smile to cross her silver-scaled features, the first genuine expression of warmth I had seen from her the entire session. "I believe," she said, "we have a great deal more to learn from you, Cadet Sloan, and I suspect, before your time at this academy concludes, we will not be the only ones asking." As the session drew to a close and researchers began gathering their notes, Professor Vantor Krell approached me quietly near the door, his expression far softer than it had been during that first lecture only weeks earlier. "Cadet Sloan," he said, "I have already begun revising my curriculum for next term. I believe the Deathworld Traits lecture requires an entirely new framework going forward." "Based on what?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Based on the only confirmed example this coalition has ever encountered," he said. "Yours." I walked out of that circular chamber that evening with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling somewhere in my chest, something between pride and quiet disbelief, and as I crossed the darkening campus grounds beneath 3 unfamiliar moons, I found myself wondering, for the first time since arriving at the academy, exactly what role I was about to play in how the rest of known space understood my entire species. I did not have to wonder for very long. Word of the council session spread through the academy faster than anything that had come before it, faster even than the story of the preserve incident, and within a week, I found myself recognized by cadets I had never spoken to, from departments I had never even visited. Most of the attention felt harmless enough, curious glances in hallways, quiet questions from strangers in the dining hall, the occasional cadet working up the courage to ask if the stories were true. What I hadn't expected was the message waiting for me on my personal terminal one quiet evening, several weeks after the council session, requesting my presence at a curriculum planning meeting for the following term's introductory xenobiology course. I arrived to find Professor Vantor Krell standing in front of the same lecture hall where this entire situation had begun, except now, the massive display screen behind him showed something entirely different from the red-lettered warning slide I remembered from my first week at the academy. "Cadet Sloan," he said, gesturing toward the screen, "I would like your opinion on something before we finalize next term's material." The display showed a new lecture framework, one I recognized immediately as a complete restructuring of his original Deathworld Traits presentation. Instead of theoretical worst-case scenarios, the slides now referenced actual documented cases, actual survey data, actual historical timelines pulled directly from the council's review sessions. "You've rebuilt the entire lecture around Earth," I said. "Around your homeworld specifically, and around the broader category it has forced this coalition to acknowledge," he said. "I intend to use it as the primary benchmark for the course going forward. The absolute upper limit of survivable conditions for intelligent life, demonstrated not through theory, but through documented, living proof." "That's a lot of pressure to put on one classroom lecture," I said. "It is considerably less pressure," he said, "than the alternative of continuing to teach cadets that such conditions are purely theoretical, only for them to encounter your species in the field someday, completely unprepared for what that actually means." I studied the revised slides for a long moment, seeing my own childhood laid out in careful, clinical detail across a display screen meant to prepare an entire generation of cadets for encounters with worlds and species far beyond anything I had ever personally experienced. "I have a proposal," Vantor Krell said, drawing my attention back to him. "I would like you to co-teach the opening session of this course next term, not as a lecturer delivering theory, but as a first-hand account. I believe the cadets would benefit considerably from hearing these details directly from someone who lived them, rather than from a professor reciting second-hand research." I thought about that request for a long moment, remembering the stunned silence that had followed my very first interruption in this exact room, the way 42 pairs of unfamiliar eyes had stared at me like I had just described something out of a nightmare rather than an ordinary childhood memory. "All right," I said finally, "I'll do it." The following term arrived faster than I expected, and on the opening day of the introductory xenobiology course, I found myself standing beside Professor Vantor Krell at the front of that same lecture hall, looking out over a new group of first-year cadets, most of them barely a few weeks into their time at the academy, their expressions carrying the same nervous uncertainty I remembered feeling myself not so long ago. "Today," Vantor Krell began, addressing the room, "we will discuss Deathworld classification. However, unlike previous terms, this discussion will not begin with theoretical models." He gestured toward me, and I stepped forward, feeling 40-odd pairs of eyes shift in my direction, most of them entirely unfamiliar with who I was or why I was standing at the front of their classroom. "My name is Mira Sloan," I said. "I'm a third-term cadet here at the academy, and I grew up on a planet called Earth. Before we begin discussing what makes a world dangerous to intelligent life, I want to tell you about an ordinary morning from when I was around 8 years old." A few cadets exchanged curious glances, clearly unsure what to make of this unusual introduction, but they listened. "My family lived near a small lake," I continued. "Every morning, before school, I would walk past that lake on my way to catch the bus. My mother taught me, from a very young age, to watch the water's edge carefully, because there were large reptilian predators living in that lake, and they occasionally came up onto the bank to warm themselves in the morning sun." A Viserian cadet near the front, pale blue and wide-eyed, raised her hand hesitantly. "You walked past an active predator every morning, alone." "Every school day," I confirmed. It wasn't considered unusual, it was just part of growing up where I grew up. I watched the same expressions ripple across this new group of cadets that I remembered from my very first day in this room, the same slow dawning realization, the same uncomfortable shift from academic curiosity into something closer to genuine unease. Over the following hour, I walked them through the same material I had once described to Dr. Bracewell in that small recording room: the storms, the toxic plants, the extreme seasonal changes, the long complicated history of conflict and cooperation that had shaped my species over countless generations. But this time, instead of simply reciting facts, I found myself pausing occasionally to answer direct questions, watching nervous first-year cadets slowly work up the courage to ask things they clearly found difficult to voice. "How did you not lose your mind with fear?" a Korvath cadet finally asked near the end of the session, his feathered ridges flattened low against his neck. "Growing up with all of that all at once." I considered the question carefully before answering, wanting to give him something honest rather than something that simply sounded impressive. "I think the truth is," I said, "you don't experience it as constant fear, not once it becomes familiar. You learn the rules early. You learn what to watch for, what to avoid, what to respect. Somewhere along the way, the fear turns into caution, and the caution becomes just another part of how you move through your day. It's not that we're fearless, it's that we grew accustomed to walking alongside danger without letting it stop us from living." The room fell quiet at that, and I noticed several cadets writing that particular answer down carefully in their notes. After the session ended and cadets filed out of the lecture hall, several of them lingered near the front, working up the courage to approach me directly. A young Thren cadet, barely out of his first week at the academy, approached hesitantly. "Cadet Sloan," he said, "if I ever encounter a hazardous environment during field training, is there anything simple I should remember? Something that might actually help, rather than just theory." I thought about that question for a moment, remembering Talia Reyes stumbling through thick brush during the preserve incident, remembering my own careful advice about watching her footing rather than the path ahead. "Watch where you're actually stepping, not where you think you're going," I said. "Move at a steady pace rather than rushing, and remember that most dangerous situations give you more warning than you expect. if you stay calm enough to notice it." He nodded seriously, committing that advice to memory with the kind of focus I remembered from my own early training, and thanked me before hurrying off to his next class. Over the following weeks, that pattern repeated itself more often than I expected. Cadets from departments I had never visited began seeking me out, not with fear or suspicion, but with genuine curiosity, asking practical questions about survival, about resilience, about the strange, difficult, remarkable history of the species that had somehow emerged from conditions the Coalition's own models still struggled to fully explain. Dr. Bracewell's department eventually published a formal survey report on Earth's classification, one that Counselor Voss herself reviewed personally before it was released more broadly across the Academy's research network. The report avoided dramatic language entirely, choosing instead careful, clinical terminology, describing Earth not as a threat, but as what the report ultimately termed an exceptional resilience outlier, a case study that would likely influence Coalition survival training curricula for generations to come. Professor Vantor Krell, for his part, became something of an unofficial expert on human history almost by accident, fielding questions from colleagues across multiple departments who had heard about his revised curriculum and wanted guidance on incorporating similar material into their own coursework. "You do realize," he said to me one afternoon, several months after that first fateful lecture, "that you have become something of a legend among incoming cadets. I have heard second-hand accounts of your story, already growing considerably more dramatic than the actual events themselves." "I've heard some of those versions too," I admitted. "Apparently in one telling, I fought off 3 alligators on my way to school every single morning." He made a sound that, for a Thren, passed as genuine amusement. "I suspect the truth requires no exaggeration, Cadet Sloan. It is remarkable enough on its own." As the term drew toward its end, I found myself once again standing at the front of that same lecture hall, this time preparing to help introduce an entirely new group of incoming cadets to their very first xenobiology lecture. Professor Vantor Krell had stepped back slightly this time, allowing me to lead more of the opening material myself, trusting me with a role I never could have imagined holding when I first sat nervously in the back row of this exact room, notebook open, feeling entirely out of place among 42 unfamiliar classmates. I watched a new professor, a younger Viserion woman recently assigned to the department, begin her opening lecture to this fresh group of cadets, presenting the same list of Deathworld traits that had once been treated purely as theoretical warning, except now framed clearly around documented history rather than abstract worst-case models. "Crushing gravity," she began, "toxic flora integrated into daily life, unstable weather, capable of leveling entire settlements, apex predators sharing territory with the dominant species, and a species capable of both organized internal conflict and remarkable sustained cooperation, all occurring simultaneously across multiple generations." I watched the new cadets' expressions shift, some skeptical, some nervous, a few already glancing toward me with quiet curiosity, clearly having heard some version of my story already circulating through the Academy's ever-present rumor network. The young professor paused, glancing toward me with a small, knowing smile, silently inviting me to step forward exactly as Professor Vantor Krell once had. I stood, feeling the same quiet weight I remembered from that very first day, except this time, instead of surprise or uncertainty, I felt something steadier settling in its place. "Let me guess," I said, smiling as 40 new pairs of eyes turned toward me, some human faces scattered among the alien ones this time, more than I had ever seen in a single classroom before. "You're about to describe my hometown." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room, along with something else, something that hadn't been there during my own first lecture all those months earlier: recognition, understanding. The beginning of a story these cadets were about to learn wasn't a warning meant to frighten them, but proof of exactly how far a species could go, even when every reasonable expectation suggested they never should have survived long enough to try. Outside the tall windows of that lecture hall, 3 familiar moons hung quietly in the evening sky, and for the first time since I had arrived at this academy, I realized I no longer felt like the strange exception in the room. I felt like proof of something worth teaching,